tell you what I think. For you see, I have read some books and I have gathered together some rogue opinions. Delivering some of those opinions is going to be like receiving a selection of donuts that you did not order. Sweet and surprising. Delivering some of the other opinions, on the other hand, is going to be kind of like watching one of the most agonising episodes of Dr. Pimple Popper. Like when you know the bad thing's coming and it's just inevitable. And there's nobody to really blame. It's just kind of grim. Sweet and surprising and grim. A nice intersection there for you. And now that I have appropriately prepared you for this, let's go. As usual, we're probably going to be here for a while. It's Leanne and welcome back to another video. As you can probably tell from the title, this video is my tops and bottoms. If you are new here, welcome. Tops and bottoms is the video in which I tell you about the best of the best books that I have read recently and the worst of the worsty worst. Books that are kind of like skimming the cream off the top of the sludge. And other books that I would use for like paper mache projects. I should probably not have used the cream analogy after the Dr. Pimple Popper thing. I apologise and I sincerely hope you haven't opened your snacks yet. For this edition of Tops and Bottoms, we have come up to a nice even number. I'm going to be talking to you about 6 books today. 3 that I loved and 3 that I aggressively did not. And I'm not gonna lie, it could have been 3 books that I loved and 4 books that I didn't, but one of the books that I didn't is How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. And honestly guys, I just have so little to say about this book except that you guys were right, it was terrible and I should always listen to you. Y'all outright told me that I was gonna hate this, and in fact more than one of you said, yes indeed Leanne, this will be your last Grady Hendrix. And those people deserve a special selection of donuts because if I'd listened to them, I could have saved myself so much time. Needless to say, Grady Hendrix for me just continues to have these wonderful premises where it's kind of like you've read a brochure for a beautiful holiday that you could go on, and then when you actually get there it's 2 stars and the all-you-can-eat buffet is just crackers. I almost feel catfished by the premises of his books at this point. And also there's a whole other level to my disappointment in that Grady Hendrix is a male author who actually writes pretty decent female characters most of the time in my opinion, but who just has plots that just go wah, 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 wah. It's particularly painful to me. So yes, technically there were actually 4 books that I did not like in this Tops and Bottoms, but talking about this book feels more like talking about an ex. It feels like this book is the end of the bad divorce with Grady Hendrix that started for me with the Final Girl support group, and now we're just bitter people who used to know each other. Alright, all of that sour stuff out of the way, and before we get into talking about the books on this list, I would first like to tell you about a trip that you might like to take, which will have much better weather and lighting than this very changeable situation. A couple of videos ago I told you guys that the wonderful people at Trover Trip were teaming up with me to go on the vacation of a lifetime and to take you guys with me. Trover Trip are a company that allow creators to meet their audiences in some absolutely beautiful places around the world. They fully curate and test these absolutely stunning vacations with full itineraries that we don't have to organise ourselves. And somebody from Trover Trip has personally slept in every one of the hotels and eaten in every one of the restaurants that you and I are going to be eating in and sleeping in together. That sounded mildly questionable, but I trust you know what I mean. And I can finally reveal to you guys now the amazing destination that has been confirmed for our trip, and it is southern Spain. We are going to begin our trip in the beautiful Sevilla, where we are going to have walking tours of the stunning architecture. There is a flamenco and tapas nights where we are going to see traditional dancers do their thing and eat some beautiful traditional food. There's a river cruise followed by sunset cocktails before we head off to Cordoba, where we will visit a local olive farm. We will get to touch things on trees and we will get a full tour of ancient stunning Cordoba. And then finally we are off to Granada, where of course the Alhambra is. We will be going into the Alhambra together, and there we're going to have tapas nights. I think we should have some reading nights and some game nights. And also, if you like me are a massive Game of Thrones fan, then we are going to be visiting some of the actual locations that they used for Dorne in the series. I am just geeked gagged. I am so excited. So if you are as excited as me and you would love to come with me to the absolutely luscious banks of southern Spain. If you would like to join in with a real life book club where we're all actually reading together and where I may actually read aloud, as you guys do know that I like to do that, then I will leave a link below where you can pop in your email address and you will be alerted as soon as the trip goes live. For the first people to book to come on the trip with me, there will be massive early bird discounts, so it does really help to get in there fast. And if you have any questions, I will be running a few Q&As over the next couple of days over on my Instagram where you can drop all of your Qs and I will A them. Oh, and yes, as previously discussed, lovely spouse Harry will be in residence. You'll get your queer mum and dad experience on this trip, that's for sure. Alright, let's go from that thing that I really like to something else that I really like. Let's start on a happy note with a top book, which I think using my non-mathematical mathing brain means that we will end on a bottom. What is happening? Can you stop? Just pick a thing and go with it. So the first book that I would like to talk to you about has a fun story attached to it. On a recent TBR of mine, I was telling you which books I was going to read for my Patreon book club, the Seance Society. We are a bi-monthly book club and we read 2 books in that 2-month period. And the reason behind that is because we are a variety book club. We read all different types of genres, and so whatever the top 2 books are usually from different places, and it means that everybody can read a book that's in a genre that they like. But when I was filming that TBR video, the poll was actually still live for the books that I was going to be reading, and so what was at the top of that poll at the time ended up being wildly different from the actual books that were picked. But one of the books that I had put on my TBR that I thought was going to win completely earwormed its way into my brain. And that is mainly because this book has been literally sitting on my TBR for years. I got a proof of this when it was about to come out, and then eventually later on in Toppings I found a beautiful signed paperback copy and I picked that up and I promptly put it on this bookcase, and then I forgot that it existed. And so for whatever reason my brain really attached itself to the idea of reading this, and I would like to believe that that was fate. I would like to believe it's because the universe knew that at that particular point I needed a really good 5-star book. Dude, are you okay? Do you need something? And it decided to deliver me this one. This is The Other Bennett Sister by Janice Hadlow, and it's so many things that I would normally not like. It's a retelling of a Jane Austen, which is something I tend to avoid. It has 1 foot in literary fiction and 1 foot in historical fiction, which are both genres that I'm not a massive fan of, and it is all of those things plus 600 odd pages. So like the odds were against this book ever actually being read in the first place, but it just goes to show that that horrible habit that I have of holding on to books for like a rainy day or the perfect time occasionally pays off, thus reinforcing that horrible delusion that that practice actually works and is correct, and that I should in fact keep doing it, which, spoiler alert, I should not. The Other Bennett Sister is of course a retelling of Pride and Prejudice from Mary's perspective. The first half of the book is essentially what happens to Mary during the events of Pride and Prejudice, and then the book hits off into a part 2 where the very worst things have happened to Mary, and now she finds herself kind of alone and adrift as like a maybe going to be spinster in this world with no real place. All of her sisters are married off, she is not, and she has to kind of find her way in the world. And I freaking loved this book. I took it on holiday with me, I started it along with some knitting, and by the time that I had finished that session I was a third of the way through this 600 page plus book and less than a third of the way through my scarf. But in fairness, it's a very complicated pattern and it involves counting, and as previously discussed, dyscalculia. But you know, anyway, the book was a winner, so you win some, you lose some. The Other Bennett Sister just did so many things right. Because Mary is basically a blank canvas in Pride and Prejudice, it gave Janice Hadlow the room to make a fully realised character that didn't feel like it was being shoehorned into a book that already existed. It felt pretty seamless. Like, Mary is this massive personality contained in this very small and quiet girl who actually has the capacity to be much larger, to take up much more space, but is just never afforded the opportunity to. And one of the things that I really loved about this book was the ways in which Mary's opportunities were actually taken away from her systematically, where the only people who actively engage with Mary are other problematic characters like Mr. Collins or even Charlotte Lucas, who sue me is a bit of a problematic character in Pride and Prejudice. And because those characters who already have their own problems with how they are perceived by society are the only people who will talk to Mary, she then in turn ends up internalising some of their more problematic behaviours, and she becomes the person who she is by the end of the book. And it was so desperately painful. And I have to say that there's like a massive trigger warning here for like parental emotional abuse and a kind of emotional neglect that's quite startling when you see it written down, but it was woven so subtly through this book. I shed some actual tears during this at a few points where I was like, you are so low and so miserable, and all you need is somebody to just like pluck you out of that situation and dust you off and give you a chance to breathe. And it's pretty impossible for me to tell you what happens in the second half of the book without giving you massive spoilers for this one. I would really say go in not knowing anything about where Mary's story goes, just like accept that the first part of the book is Pride and Prejudice and the second part of the book is like a new book entirely, and just let yourself sink into it. It is like such an experience of a book. And as you probably worked out, I did pick it up on audiobook, which was how I was able to knit while I was reading it. The audiobook narrator is beautiful. She is brilliant. She is so smart with the choices that she makes for that character. I loved it so much. It was a performance audiobook and it just made me so happy. The one thing that I will say about it is that, as I've said a couple of times, it is over 600 pages, which did feel overly long. There were a couple of sections where Mary was just kind of coming to terms with things and doing the same thing over and over again and having the same kind of conversations over and over again in two sections of the book, which I'm like, that could have been condensed. We could have had it once and then we could have had the knowledge that it happened with other people and we wouldn't have missed anything out particularly. And also because of course there is a romance in the second part of this book. That's something that is on the synopsis and in the taglines for this book, so it's not like a big surprise that Mary will eventually get some sort of romance herself. But there was a trope used in that romance which I do not particularly care for, which is one of those like misunderstanding things that could have just been ironed out if any one person had spoken to the other person in the situation. And that made me a bit frustrated, and it made me feel like it was a little bit of a stretch for the characters. Like those two were so close that I was like, really, you're not going to talk about that? Are you sure? But it didn't spoil the book for me because I was able to suspend my disbelief given like the societal conventions of the time. But yeah, I feel like I've talked about this book for a really, really long time, but I'm really passionate about it and I just cannot believe that I left it sitting on my shelf for such a long time when this is how I feel about it. If you like Pride and Prejudice even just a little bit, even if you've only seen the mini-series and you haven't read the book, I think you should read this because I think you will love it. Okay, next let's talk about a book that I should have DNF'd. To be quite blunt about it, I should have given this book up at the 1/3 mark, where I could feel that things were going massively south for me, where I was already not happy with a lot of the things that I had read. This one is a prime example of what I was talking about in my last video, where I was like, I think that I really need to start evaluating when I am just kind of liking a book, when the book is just okay, when the book's maybe going to get like 3 stars or less for me, and deciding, okay, I don't think this is going to get any better, I'm just going to give it up, rather than continuing to plod through with it. Like, I'm a very proficient DNFer, but sometimes those books, the books where I'm like, this is fine, will just slip through the cracks. And again, if I look at my overall reading for this year, there have been several books which fit that description. Several books to which my reaction now is just like, meh. So this book is A Light Amongst Shadows by Kelly York. It was one of the backlist books that had been sitting on my Kindle for a little while. It has been sold to me so enthusiastically a bunch of times because it's essentially like dark academia meets like a ghostly haunted private school story. And to be fair, that's like exactly what it is. That's exactly what it delivers, is what it says on the tin. But unfortunately, it doesn't deliver anything else. And within that, it doesn't deliver any of the things in a satisfying way. When I started reading this book, I thought that it was set somewhere in the 1940s. The language was like quite antiquated, but it wasn't quite old antiquated. Like, I didn't feel like I was in the Victorian period particularly, but it turns out I was dead wrong. It took me until halfway through this book where the author finally was like, oh yeah, by the way, we actually are in the Victorian period. Like, surprise! And it so thoroughly catapulted me out of the book that I immediately went to Goodreads and started scrolling through all of the other reviews, and any of the negative reviews for this book have basically said the same thing. They had no idea when it was set, and then when they were finally told when it was set, they were like, really? And it just kind of destroyed my suspension of disbelief, to be honest. I, from that point, really heavily felt the author's influence, and I really heavily felt like I was being told that I should have certain feelings about this setting and this time period that I didn't have. And I hate that so much in books. I hate when the author tells you how you should feel as opposed to like lulls you into feeling that way all on your own. On top of that, this was sold to me as an adult book, but it reads aggressively like a YA book. It is possible to talk about people who are in a boarding school or a college setting in a way that is not a YA or a new adult book. It is entirely possible. It's exactly what The Secret History does, for example, and that's just not a place that I live anymore. I pick up very few YA books these days. Most of the ones that I do pick up come from people that I really trust, who I know my reading tastes. But this book felt overwrought in a way that wasn't believable. Not in that like really beautiful, deeply angsty way, but just in a like, oh, would you grow up way. In that way where it's no longer comfortable to read about your emotions because they're just not that interesting. This one is also a queer romance, which was doubly disappointing when we saw like insta love and insta devotion and I will die for you no matter what, even though we've only spoken 3 sentences to each other. Some of the times that the main characters were talking to each other, I was physically like, and knowing that it was meant to be set in the Victorian period made me feel like the author had read a bunch of Victorian novels and then was just trying to emulate the style without actually understanding it. Using the language of the time but not understanding like the societal pressures or the social conventions or any of the nuance behind it. And unfortunately, reading it back to back with the other Bennett sister just kind of highlighted for me how much better the other book had done it. And what can I say about the ghost parts of it? Just like meh. In fact, that's kind of a nice sum up for this whole book. Just meh. Next up, we have another book that I absolutely loved, but when I say that out loud, I'm like, why? Because this book served me so much emotional damage. I was so broken by this book. This book hurt me in so many new and interesting ways, and yet I am obsessed, nay fascinated, and I will be continuing on with the rest of the series so fast, so much so that I might already be listening to the second book. And that book is Red Rising by Pierce Brown, which is the first book in the Red Rising series, and I don't feel okay. I have still not recovered from what this book did to me. This is a weird tops and bottoms because apart from one book on this list, I think all of the other books that are in both the top and the bottoms were books that I wouldn't necessarily have said would be me books. Like, on the surface, I don't necessarily think Red Rising sounds like a book that I would pick up. It's about a man called Darrow. He is mining under the surface of Mars for a substance known as helium-3. This substance is the only thing that can be used to terraform the surface of Mars in order to allow all of the people from Earth, which is apparently dying and in horrible states of climate change and starvation and stuff, to move over onto the surface of Mars and colonize that planet. So Darrow is doing this in the full knowledge that he is saving people. Until one day Darrow discovers that actually the surface of Mars has been terraformed for literally hundreds of years, and that all of his people who have lived for generations under the surface, who have never seen sky or fresh air or anything like that, are actually slaves. And at that point, Darrow decides, with help, that he is going to infiltrate the society on the surface of Mars which run this whole operation, and he is going to wreck it from within. So for a start, it's kind of a dystopia, which I do not read. I just flat out don't read dystopian fiction. It does not do it for me. Secondly, it's one of those books that on the surface really has the potential to be like a one-note emotional book, you know, like just pain or depression all the way through, which is something that I've told you guys, like, I don't particularly enjoy. I need there to be peaks and troughs even in my books that are about war and horrible things happening. And 3, it's technically starting a brand new sci-fi series, which is something that I don't do a lot these days either. But the thing that made me pick this up is how much Becca loves these books, is how incredibly much Becca is obsessed with these books, because Becca and I's taste in sci-fi and fantasy are very closely linked. And I was like, okay girl, I have heard you tell me that these books are the shit for such a long time, and I'm finally gonna listen to you. And she was right. These books are the shit. But they also carved my heart out of my body and left it a bloody mess on the floor. I almost have no words to like describe the reasons why I loved this one so much, but there's something in this book which links together something which I've noticed in a lot of my favourite sci-fi and fantasy, which is the ability to do tiny, minute, subtle character work on this massively epic world stage. Like, the plot is ostensibly about changing the entire world, changing the political system and the fabric of this world. And yet, while that huge cinematic stuff is going on in the background, we are getting like so deeply and intricately into these characters' heads that we know them as well as we know ourselves, and we are rooting for them despite the fact that some of them are terrible people. Morally grey is the shade of this entire world, which is a very funny joke if you know that there's a colour cast system in this world. And if you didn't, now you do, and you're required to laugh. Because of the circumstances of this world, because of the circumstances all of these characters find themselves in, there's no way for any of them to be a completely good person or to make choices that are like 100% okay for everybody. And as a result of that, you are left rooting for people that you're going, oh, like, I'm not okay that you caused that to happen, and yet I am fully in your corner. I also don't know how he managed to leave every chapter on the biggest cliffhanger and not make it feel gimmicky. Instead, I'm like, oh my god, read more pages! Or listen to more pages, as the case may be in this one, because I also took Becca's advice on picking up the audiobooks for this, and the narrator is fantastic. And also, if you, like me, are just starting this series and you don't know what the hell is going on with the publication of the books, the original series is 3 books, it is a trilogy, and we are now 4 books into the second part of this series, effectively, which I think in total is going to end up being 10 books long. Or at least that is my understanding of it. The newest book to come out is Lightbringer, which I think is book 4 in the second part of this series. So I'm in it for the long haul, kids. I done started another series, but hopefully if I keep loving it this much, I can just catch up to it as it's published and read the books as they're being published, and then I won't be behind on a series. Flipping back to the dark side of this list, let's talk about another book which didn't work for me. And without any preamble, this book is On the Savage Side by Tiffany McDaniel, which does mean that I've just made another bad pun about sides. Apparently it's a bad pun kind of day, forgive me. On the Savage Side was a book which immediately caught my attention because of the cover, and I think the cover is so smart for this book because it kind of immediately conveys exactly what it is. When I looked at the cover of this, I immediately thought this is a literary fiction slash thriller which is set in the American South, and it deals with poverty, and that is exactly what it is. Like, the marketing people who made the cover for this book are amazing, and I did have a signed copy because I did hope that I was going to love it, but alas, I did not love it. It's interesting because when I was buying this book, the bookseller who scanned it through the till for me looked at it and went, oh, is that by the same author that wrote Betty? And I was like, I do not know, because Betty is literary fiction, and so I have paid absolutely no attention to it. And she looked it up and she was like, yes, it is. I will warn you, Betty was so sad that I had to DNF it, even though I was absolutely in love with it and it was one of the best books I had ever read. And as soon as she said that, I was like, well, hand me that challenge. And she was so right. This book is so incredibly sad. It's so depressing. There are so many trigger warnings for this, for sexual violence, for everything that comes along with institutionalized poverty. Honestly, if you want to pick this one up and you feel like you need trigger warnings before you go into books, I really encourage you to look up a full list of them for this one, because there are just so many things. So this one is about twin sisters Arcade and Daffodil. They are growing up in an extremely impoverished area. Their mother is an alcoholic and a drug user, and they live with her and their aunt in a really sort of ramshackle, falling down house, and they see a lot, like a lot in their lives, and you start with them when they're quite young children and follow on from there, which is very difficult to read about. But that's only kind of the setup for this one, because the backdrop of this one is based on an actual true crime where several women along this one stretch of river were going missing and then were found floating in the river with absolutely no clues as to who had committed the crime or how they were connected in any way. And those parts of the book were fascinating because we actually also get the point of view of the river at the beginning, which sounds kind of a little off the wall and out there, but it actually really works. It's a really amazing point of view, but it's just not enough to take this book over the line for me. The thing that really got me about this book is that it is beautifully written. Like, it is absolutely stunningly written, but it reads like a fairy tale. A very sort of twisted Grimm's fairy tale brought into the modern world. And I ended up having a lot of problems with that because it kept me at arm's length from the characters in a way that I found like so irritating that I wanted to scratch my skin off in a few places. I was like, just let me get through the layers of this to the actual people. And while I get that that is probably just Tiffany McDaniel's style, the style did not work for me. I felt like every time I was starting to get to the meat of what was going on, I was thrown out again with yet another like lengthy description of a spider web, and how a spider web was a metaphor for something that was going on between the girls, and how the girl's life was spider web to the mum. And like, there's just so many bits of this which is like, yeah, one time that's great, like one time, one spider web is amazing, that's great writing. 16 spider webs over the course of like one half of this book was too many spider webs. That being said, I was buddy reading this one with my lovely friend Jill, and she absolutely adored it. She carried on with it. She loved the fairy tale style. She felt like it kept her reading and it kept the momentum of the book going for her. So potentially, if that is something that really does work for you, then you might like this one, but it was definitely not for me. I was not the target audience. I went in looking for more of like a thrillery, true crimey feel, even though, you know, it's obviously fictionalized, and I ended up somewhere else that was just far too surrealist literary fiction for my tastes. And the final happy book that is on this list is one that I've been talking to you guys about ad nauseum over the last couple of months, and I figured it was finally time that I put it in a tops and bottoms and just dealt with it, got my joy out, and then moved on so that you guys can stop hearing me ranting about it. And that book is A Curious Beginning by Deanna Rayborn. This is the first book in the Veronica Speedwell series, which is a series of 10 books, I want to say. Actually, hold on, I can count them because I own them all now. 7, and I think that the most recent one is just out in hardback, and that's why I didn't pick it up. So 8. So we've got 8 published books in this series with no real end in sight, I think. So A Curious Beginning is about Veronica. She is an orphaned girl who has been taken in by 2 maiden aunts who are extremely wealthy. They have brought her up in 18 something or other, first half of the 1800s, I think, to basically teach herself about anything that she is interested in. That was her schooling. You are allowed to learn about anything as long as you learn things. And by God, she did. But because she's been brought up kind of outside of society, she has a very odd idea, at least by their terms, of what is acceptable when it comes to relationships, when it comes to what is appropriate for women, when it comes to making money as a woman. And so when her last aunt finally dies, Veronica is, you know, very sad but also very happy, because what she wants to do is go and hunt butterflies for a living. But when she gets back to her cottage after her aunt's funeral, she discovers that it's been completely ransacked, and a German baron is there being like, I knew your aunts, you're in really, really horrible trouble, you need to come away with me. And she thinks, hey, free ticket to London, let's go. But when they get there, he squirrels her away in what looks like on the outside a warehouse for safekeeping, and the person whose hands he delivers her into is called Stoker. Stoker is a grizzly, angry, slightly feral gentleman who is a taxidermist, and I don't mean he taxidermies tiny beautiful birds or like people's dogs, I mean he taxidermies whole massive things for like the British Museum and stuff like that. They hate each other so very much, and it's delicious. So I would classify this series as like predominantly a mystery series, but also massively a romance series. I have been on the search for a romance series that actually works for me for such a long time, and I just keep coming up against the same tropes and the same kind of like mediocre people or toxic men. And then my lovely friend and co-host of the Around the Disc in 800 Days readathon that I am running right now, Kirsty, recommended this series to me. She was like, this will be perfect for bedtime, it'll be perfect for your brain. There's mild peril in it, but not in a way that's going to cause like existential spinnies, and you are going to be absolutely clapping your little hands and jumping up and down in your little bed, because these two are precious in a way that is like so bad. And as I say, it's now all on my shelf because I'm absolutely obsessed with it. Like, I don't usually get those feelings with characters. It takes a lot to get me there, and I feel like it's Deanna Raybourn's writing that gets me there, because her writing is so good. I'm in love with her writing. I'm in love with this series. I'm so happy that I picked it up. I don't care that I've added it as another 8-book series to my series tracker. Like, I don't care, because it's so good. And then finally, obviously, we are ending on a bit of a bum note, because this book is a book that on the surface should absolutely have worked for me. It should very much have been in my wheelhouse. I should have adored it, and in fact I have seen so many people whose reviews I usually have a lot of symmetry with review this and be like, oh, it was great, it was game changing for me, while I'm sitting in the background being like, really? Was it though? Or was it just one thing in disguise as another thing? And the book that I am talking about is Friendaholic by Elizabeth Day. This book is essentially a memoir by Elizabeth Day, where she looks at her toxic relationship with friendships and how the idea of quantity in friendships overtakes the idea of quality, and how she was always told and taught that it was a good idea if she had lots and lots and lots of friends, but then when she does have lots and lots and lots of friends, she can't maintain those relationships, and she also discovers that they're actually not there for her in the way that she is there for them, that they don't spend every waking moment thinking about ways to make sure that she is happy, but that's what she is doing for them. And for that reason, I thought this book is absolutely going to be for me. Like, it's going to teach me so many lessons about the friendships in my life, friendships which I have like lost in the last 10 years, and friendships which I am still making and are trying to make stronger, and the idea of like curating a small group of very intimate friends as opposed to like this big spiderweb network where you don't actually have any time for yourself. And recently I feel like as an adult I've been learning a lot of lessons about what friendship means to me, and about the idea of not looking for yourself in friendships, not looking for a mirror of what you give, but actually looking what that person is giving to you on the surface on its own. So I feel like those were things that were already like predominant in my mind when I picked this book up. And the first 2 chapters of this book feel really profound for that reason, because I genuinely think that everything that Elizabeth Day had to say about friendship was in those first 2 chapters. And the way that she was like, there is actually no language to talk about friendship in our modern day, especially not as adults who have so much more access to friendship. Like, everything that she said there was great. But unfortunately, the book then did 2 things that really pissed me off. Like, just straight up made me really actually deeply angry. The first one of those is that, as I said, she sets up this idea that there is no language to talk about friendship in like a way that everybody can use and it's accessible to everybody. But that was kind of what this book was marketed to be about. She was supposed to be talking about friendship in a way that built language to talk about friendship, and that's not what she's doing. Like, I just don't get the purpose of this book, because in each chapter she's kind of like tearing apart one of her friendships to kind of like see the root causes in it and make connections that are patterns that she is doing in a toxic way, and then make language to talk about them so that she can tell us about them, and that's not what she does. She just continually reinforces the point that there is no language and there is no way for adults to talk about adult friendships, and I was just like, why are we here? And if you're sitting there thinking that my thoughts and synopsis about this book have gone in just a couple of really big concentric circles, then you're correct, because that's exactly what this book does. It just takes you on the same merry-go-round again and again and again, and it doesn't make any new points. But the second thing that this book did, which really just burnt my popcorn in a way that I did not enjoy, was that this book became less about Elizabeth's friendships and more about her infertility journey, and how the friendships that she had set up for herself in her life did not support her in that infertility journey, and how people fell away from her when they realised she was struggling with this, or they didn't know what to say, and how she was going to friends who were like long established friends who she'd given a lot to and they weren't giving anything back. And it didn't feel honest. It didn't feel like this book was honestly a book about friendships. It felt like what Elizabeth wanted to write was a book about infertility, and a book about how difficult it is to connect with other people during it, and how the experience is very isolating. But that is a really saturated market right now. And it felt to me massively like she just kind of looked at that market and went, ugh, there's no room for this book, so therefore I'm going to write this other one which looks at a different aspect of my infertility experience, and I will make a book out of that. And I'm annoyed about this one, not only as somebody who has dealt with infertility in her own life and who now is in a very good place about it, but previously, like maybe even like 5 years ago, would not have been in a place where if I had picked this up and this book had suddenly become an infertility book, that I would have been okay with that. But also as somebody who is just a book consumer who is really annoyed at the way that in the last sort of 4 or 5 years publishers have been publishing books which are jacketed as one thing and end up being something completely different. And the fact that over the last 5 years publishers have started to do this more and more often has actually like made me move away from whole genres. You guys might have noticed that my thriller selections have gone like this over the past 5 years, that I have picked up less and less and less and less every year. And that is because at least 2 out of every 3 books that I pick up are not what the synopsis leads me to believe that they are. And I just don't understand the logic behind it, because fundamentally I don't think that by misjacketing something and then putting it in a reader's hands you're going to be like, oh, you didn't think you would like this, but actually you do, don't you? I think 90% of the time the person reading that is like, this was not what I wanted it to be, 3 stars. Which I feel like is a rant that I just keep having to have because it doesn't feel like it's getting better. So yes, in conclusion, this one made me an extremely bitter Betty. And that's it, guys. That is the end of this tops and bottoms. I hope that you have enjoyed the extreme side of salt with your sweetness, and I hope that maybe I have encouraged you to pick up some of my favourite books from this video. If you have made it this far into the video, then please leave me the little magnifying glass emoji down below, so that hopefully together we can spot all of those fake books, ones that are not in the genres that they say that they are actually in. And remember, if you would like to come on a holiday with me to the beautiful, luscious south of Spain, then remember and put your email address in that link down below in my description to be notified of when my trip goes live. The making of this video has been supported by the wonderful patrons on my locked tier of my Patreon. Thank you so much to Laura Ann, Samantha H, Samantha S, Silky and Cinderella. If you would like to join us in the slightly haunted town of Lochfern for sprints, book clubs and more, then the link for that is down below. If you are new here, I hope that you stick around to find out which books that I love next month. Hit that subscribe button if you would like to. And if you have enjoyed this video, please hit that thumbs up because it really does help my channel. And I will speak to you guys soon. Bye!